At 7:20 on a Tuesday morning, my stepdaughter called to tell me my husband had passed away during the night. She followed that up by claiming he had left everything to her. Meanwhile, my husband was sitting 3 feet away from me, calmly spreading butter on a slice of toast. I stared across the table at him and thought to myself that this was going to be an extremely strange breakfast. Clara talked in a completely flat voice, which somehow made the whole situation feel much worse. She stated that her father died last night, causing David to stop mid-motion with his butter knife hovering over his plate. I raised a single finger to my lips to keep him quiet as Clara continued her speech. She proudly declared that she had been left everything, including the house, the bank accounts, and all assets, leaving me with absolutely nothing. Before I could even formulate a response, her husband Aaron piped up in the background with a mocking laugh, saying they were finally rid of me. That was the exact moment something inside me went dead silent. I immediately tapped the speakerphone button and placed the phone on the wooden table between us. Clara kept babbling about coming over later that afternoon to secure her father's property and suggested I start packing my things to avoid making this process any harder than it needed to be. Across from me, David slowly placed his knife on the side of his plate while Clara went completely quiet on the line. After a long, tense silence, David leaned toward the phone and asked his daughter if he could finish his breakfast before she started clearing out his home. I heard Aaron mutter a quiet expression of utter confusion right before the call abruptly disconnected. David stared at the dark screen of my phone for several seconds without saying a word. In the background, the coffee maker clicked off and a neighbor started up a lawnmower, making the morning feel absurdly normal despite the bizarre circus that had just taken place. David finally broke the silence by mentioning that his daughter sounded disappointed to hear his voice, and I could tell that realization hurt him far more than any talk about money ever could. David was 66 years old at the time, and his recent retirement from his plumbing company had not been kind to his health or his spirit. After nearly 40 years of manual labor, crawling under houses and hauling heavy equipment, he had finally hung up his tool belt 3 years prior. Once he stopped working, he put on 30 pounds. His replaced knee pained him constantly, and a new heart medication made him terribly dizzy whenever he stood up too fast. There were plenty of mornings when the strong man who used to lift water heaters up basement stairs needed my help just to pull on his compression socks. He usually made light of it, but 2 nights before Clara's absurd phone call, David had suffered severe chest pains while we were watching television. I drove him straight to the emergency room in nearby Carmel, where the doctors kept him overnight because his heart rhythm was wildly inconsistent. He came home Monday afternoon feeling tired, grumpy, and thoroughly convinced that hospital food was a form of cruel and unusual punishment. We thought that was the end of the medical scare, but we later discovered our neighbor Tom had left Clara a frantic voicemail after seeing the ambulance in our driveway. Tom told her that David had experienced another health emergency and that I had taken him back to the hospital. Clara called the hospital late that night, but since she was not listed as his primary medical proxy, the staff refused to give her detailed updates. By the next morning, David had already been discharged, so when Clara called his empty room, the nurse simply told her he was no longer there. Instead of calling my cell phone to check on her father's condition, she immediately assumed he was dead and jumped straight to taking over his estate. David pushed his breakfast plate away and asked how his daughter could possibly know what his last will and testament said. I actually had an answer to that question, even though I hated having to tell him. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked into David's home office and caught Clara crouched down next to his locked filing cabinet. She had jumped up quickly and nervously claimed she was just looking for old insurance papers. And I had let the matter drop because I spent 14 years trying not to be the stereotypical suspicious second wife. David's first wife, Sarah, had passed away from cancer long before I entered the picture, and Clara was already a grown woman when we married, so I never tried to replace her mother. For over a decade, Clara and I had maintained a perfectly pleasant relationship, but everything changed the moment David retired and his health began to decline. Suddenly, she was asking constant questions about how much money he made from selling his business, whose name was on the house deed, and where his investments were held. David always defended her curiosity as harmless filial concern, so I stopped pushing the issue, though sitting at the breakfast table that morning, I deeply regretted keeping quiet. At 8 in the morning, David's mobile phone rang, displaying the name of his longtime estate lawyer, Arthur Vance. David answered with a calm greeting, but within seconds, his expression completely transformed into sheer disbelief. Arthur had received a call earlier that morning from someone reporting David's death and citing the exact date of an old will David had signed 12 years ago before we ever got married. Under that outdated document, Clara was indeed the sole heir to his entire estate, and as David ended the call, he looked toward his office and quietly realized his daughter was not grieving his death, but actively anticipating it. Arthur wanted us in his office immediately, so I grabbed my keys while David slowly stood up, favoring his bad leg as his untouched breakfast sat getting cold on the table. Arthur's law office was located about 20 minutes away near the commercial district, and I handled the driving while David stared silently out the passenger window of his truck. For most of our marriage, David insisted on driving everywhere we went, but after his knee surgery and frequent dizzy spells, I had gradually taken over behind the wheel. When I asked if he was holding up okay, he tried to joke that he had experienced better Tuesdays, but his forced smile vanished almost instantly. Arthur was waiting for us in a private conference room with a thick manila file laid out on the large wooden table. He confirmed that the old will sitting in his files named Clara as the primary beneficiary, leaving almost everything to her while granting a small portion to a local children's charity. Arthur explained that whoever called his office clearly knew the details of that 12-year-old document, though what Clara evidently did not realize was that David had completely updated his estate plan 5 years prior. The new will protected my right to remain in our home, secured my retirement savings, provided Clara with a generous inheritance, and established substantial college trust funds for her children. Arthur folded his hands and revealed another unsettling detail. Clara and her husband Aaron had secretly visited his office 6 months earlier to ask probing questions about legal guardianship. They had asked Arthur what steps were required to take over an aging parent's bank accounts and legal affairs if a spouse was allegedly making poor financial choices. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I remembered Thanksgiving dinner, when Aaron had openly mocked David's difficulty navigating his online bank accounts and joked about taking his passwords away. What had seemed like a lighthearted family joke at the time now felt like a terrifyingly calculated plan to strip David of his independence. On the drive back home, David desperately tried to rationalize his daughter's bizarre behavior, suggesting she might have panicked or been manipulated by Aaron after hearing about the ambulance. I pulled into a casual cafe so we could get a warm drink, and as we sat by the window, I gently pointed out that believing he had died did not explain why she was already prepared to kick me out of our house. David stirred his coffee in silence, and I immediately felt guilty for speaking so harshly about a daughter he had raised, supported, and loved through every stage of her life. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Clara and Aaron arrived at our front door, with Clara putting on a dramatic display of tears as she threw her arms around her father. She sobbed that the hospital refused to give her information and that she truly believed he was gone. But David remained rigid in her embrace and asked why she had not simply called me. Aaron stepped in to defend her, claiming they were panicked, though I kept my mouth shut to avoid starting a shouting match right there in the entryway. The tone of the conversation quickly shifted as Aaron began bringing up David's recent driving incident, a minor late fee on a utility bill, and his missing cardiology appointment. Clara then looked her father in the eye and announced that they were deeply concerned about his mental capacity, prompting David to ask directly if she was worried about him or his money. Clara immediately turned her anger toward me, accusing me of isolating her father and controlling his life ever since his health began to fail. When I pointed out that I was simply caring for my husband after his major surgeries, Clara casually dropped a bombshell by stating they had already consulted an elder law attorney regarding formal adult guardianship. David stared at her in utter shock as he realized his own child was actively trying to have a judge declare him mentally unfit to manage his own life. The very next morning, a court server knocked on our door and handed David official legal papers confirming that Clara had officially filed a petition for temporary guardianship. David sat down at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, completely devastated that his daughter was taking him to court to strip away his basic rights. Yesterday, she had tried to inherit his wealth as if he were dead, and today she was using legal paperwork to take control of his life while he was still breathing. We immediately scheduled an urgent consultation with a respected elder law specialist named Eleanor Vance to help us fight the petition. Eleanor reviewed the court filings carefully and warned us not to underestimate the serious nature of the allegations, even if they were born out of greed and spite. Clara had strategically crafted her petition using real facts, highlighting David's recent hospitalization, his knee replacement, his minor fender bender in a parking lot, and the single time he accidentally double-paid an electric bill. The legal team arranged for David to undergo a comprehensive cognitive assessment with a specialist to prove his mind was completely sound. I watched from the corner of the room as the doctor asked David to recall words, perform mental math, and explain how he managed his daily routine. David answered every question perfectly, but as we walked back to the truck after the appointment, he stopped by the door and looked entirely defeated. He admitted that when he was younger, forgetting a detail just meant he was tired, but at his age, every minor slip was recorded on a clipboard as proof of decay. Clara had managed to make him deeply self-conscious about getting older, turning every stiff step and forgotten detail into a source of anxiety and self-doubt. Meanwhile, rumors spread through our small community, and I endured cold stares from former friends who clearly suspected I was taking advantage of a confused elderly man. While preparing our defense, Eleanor decided to audit David's financial records from the previous few years to disprove Clara's claim that his finances were chaotic. During the audit, Eleanor discovered roughly $187,000 in unauthorized transfers and strange account activity starting around the time of David's knee surgery. It turned out David had given Clara temporary online access to help pay his medical bills while he was recovering from surgery, and she had systematically moved large sums of money into accounts tied to Aaron's failing construction business. When Eleanor showed us the documents, David was stunned to see his own signature authorizing Clara's access, causing him to panic and wonder if his memory was failing him after all. That night, I found David sitting alone in the dark guest room, holding an old childhood photograph of Clara sitting on his shoulders at a county fair. He quietly confessed that he was terrified he might have given her permission and forgotten about it, wondering if his mind was truly slipping away just as she claimed. I sat beside him and wrapped my arm around his shoulders, holding back my own tears because I knew that a forged signature would have been easier to bear than the heartbreaking possibility that his daughter had abused his complete trust. The following morning, Eleanor called us back into her office to clarify the exact legal scope of the financial authorization form David had signed years ago. She explained that while David had indeed signed a valid document granting Clara temporary permission to pay his personal bills, she had blatantly violated her legal fiduciary duties by routing his funds into her own accounts. The authorization explicitly limited her actions to managing David's personal care expenses, meaning every single transfer to Aaron's business and their personal credit cards constituted outright financial exploitation. David sat in complete silence as the reality sank in. His daughter had not just made a mistake. She had methodically taken advantage of his physical vulnerability to steal his hard-earned savings. On the drive home, the tension between David and me finally exploded when he frantically tried to argue that maybe he had verbally told her she could help Aaron's business out of pity. I pulled the car over and told him firmly that I refused to sit by and watch him doubt his own sanity just to shield his daughter from the consequences of her own cruel actions. He stormed upstairs the moment we got home, leaving me alone in the kitchen washing the same clean dishes over and over again while trying to process the painful rift that was tearing our family apart. 2 days later, we attended the formal court hearing where Eleanor presented David's flawless cognitive evaluation results alongside the detailed bank records proving Clara's systematic financial theft. The judge reviewed the evidence with a severe expression before dismissing Clara's guardianship petition entirely and ordering an immediate freeze on all accounts connected to the stolen funds. Clara stood in the courtroom sobbing, not out of remorse for what she had done to her father, but out of sheer panic over the pending criminal investigation into her financial fraud. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, David stopped on the steps and took a long, deep breath of fresh air. He turned to me, held my hand tightly, and apologized for letting his denial blind him to the truth for so long. Protecting his peace had cost him a piece of his heart, but as we drove away together, I knew we had finally reclaimed his dignity, his freedom, and our life.